Hey, what's up? I'm Allie, and welcome back to my channel. The spooky season is here, and every year I become slightly obsessive about some sort of paranormal being. And, well, vampires tends to be at the top of that list. I don't know if it's just me, if it's just something that I've noticed, or if it really is a trend again, but it seems like more vampire stories are being published, and it feels like it is on trend. It made me wonder why there is such a large appeal to blood-sucking immortals, but even I, have always loved vampires. And I was thinking on it, and I was like, I can't pinpoint when I first learned about vampires. I know the first stories that I read about vampires, but I couldn't pinpoint when I first knew about them. I don't know, I want to assume it was the first book that I read, but I feel like it wasn't. I had some understanding of what a vampire is. And I was thinking, I was like, vampires have always been kind of my obsession. As a kid, I read the Darren Shan saga, or the Search of Freak saga is what I like to call it. They were my favorite. I love those. They really got me into reading. And then as a preteen, I loved the Vampire Kisses series. And then as a teen, I loved Twilight, but I also read Peeps around that time as well. So I've always been in love with these stories. They've been my favorite throughout life. So as an adult, I was like, what have I read? I recently read The Beautiful, and I've read Vampire Academy, but they're not my favorite. Midnight Sun just released, and the next year we have Empire the Vampire, which I'm so stinking excited for. There are stories a coming. There are gonna be some other new releases that we talk about later in this video. I don't know, I felt like I just needed to find out more. I needed to understand why there's such this appeal to these immortal beings. I want to understand, and I was like, what can I do? I'll become one, of course. Just kidding. These are really hard to talk in. These teeth are really hard to talk in. I also don't like the taste of blood. Not great. But I can read about them. So I spent the last month getting to know more about the vampires that we love and the vampires we hate within books. To really get the full scope of things, I felt I had to start at the beginning. So, first, we have Dracula. Obviously, I have to read Dracula, given its influence that it's had over many, many years. Through even movies and shows and books today, it is still a highly influential vampire story. It's one of the first things that you think about when you think about vampires is Dracula. So, it's number one on the list. We tend to think of Dracula as the first. I know I do, but Dracula wasn't the first. The literary vampire first appeared in the 18th century with Polidori's The Vampire. Many believe that Vlad the Impaler was one of the first inspirations for vampires, but Polidori's The Vampire was actually based around his friend, Lord Byron. Is it because Lord Byron kept coffins in his dining room? Is it because he used skulls as flower pots and drinkware? It seems like it actually came from a much more fun perspective. Polidori was actually Lord Byron's doctor, and he presented the idea of the vampire at the same writing group that Mary Shelley presented Frankenstein. The vampire was the first to show the aristocratic type vampire. That's a hard one to say. This type of vampire could then mix with the highest in society and then lure them back to their deep, dark lairs, essentially, using their charm, which Lord Byron was quite good at. His charm. I don't know if he lured people anywhere. But I can see them sitting around having a nice laugh when they decided that the name in The Vampire was going to be a nickname that one of Lord Byron's scorned lovers gave him. You want to talk about Dracula? Very well. So though there were other publications that came before Dracula, it wasn't the first of its kind. It came along in 1897, changed the genre, essentially. It is easy to see the influences of Dracula in media even today. It is probably the most well-known vampire title, and it's easy to see why. In short, Dracula is essentially about, well, Dracula, as he travels from Transylvania to England in order to spread vampirism or his undead curse. But it also follows a group of vampire hunters, essentially, who are under the influence of Van Helsing, who is probably another very popular name in vampire myths and legends, but we'll save that for another day. But Dracula essentially is about this war happening between them and Dracula. I didn't really know what to expect going into Dracula. I knew it was a classic, so I was kind of going into it knowing it probably wasn't going to be the most enjoyable for me. I did love that it was an epistolary format. I hope that I am saying that right. It's a little hard. Which essentially means that it's told through various diaries and letters and news clippings and things like that, which is just a format that I love. But other than that, I didn't know what to expect going into this. And even though it's horror, I wasn't really expecting to be scared, but 50 pages in, I was sweating. I was very nervous. I assumed that the story was going to follow Dracula, however, we don't really follow Dracula that much. Dracula is missing for the majority of this book. He's kind of hinted at, and the things that he has done are mentioned, but Dracula himself is only really mentioned at the beginning, a little bit in the middle, and then the end. It actually follows, which I was not expecting, several other people who essentially become affected by Dracula and his lifestyle. And it is how they band together to further understand and defeat this evil. I was a little worried because there were a lot of over-detailing happening, which tends to happen in classics. But I will say by the midpoint, I was hooked because this focused more on vampire lifestyle and what vampires do and how you become a vampire and things like that, transforming into a vampire. Like, I was interested in that. But the second half lost me. It got bogged down in a lot of mundane details that I just didn't care about. Dracula's missing, and by the time we reached the final scene with Dracula, it just all felt so anticlimactic. What a waste. Even though the overall reading experience was probably a 3 for me overall, it is no wonder that this became so popular and that this really was the starting point, because Stoker has the blueprints to a vampire right here. He's handing over the instructions, but he doesn't hand over all the secrets, so it's enough to take away from and then work on. So it is no wonder that this was such an influence to the genre, to horror, to paranormal books, and just open the door for so many opportunities to grow from here. Because here's the basics, now do with it what you will. I feel like we can still see a lot of his influence today, because there's always the fangs, and not always, but there is the aversion to sunlight to some degree, and the charm. I feel like the charm is one that gets overlooked a lot, because even though Dracula was kind of scary, he still had a charm about him. So he was quite arrogant too. He was a little bit of an asshole. Aren't they all, though? Aren't they all? You know, once you finish Dracula, it's like, where do you go from here? What happens next? But I think for now, I'll just take a nap. After Dracula, there were other vampire books, of course, but I was trying to stick to the ones that I felt were the most important and the ones that stood out the most or have had some sort of impact on media beyond that. So we're going to have to do a little bit of a time jump here from 1897 to 1976. This is one of the more famous, in my opinion, and it is the one that I think about when I think of vampires in the media. Interview with a Vampire is the first thing that comes to my mind when I think vampires in the media. Whoa. What about The Stand? No. It came out around this time period, you know. King and I have proven not to get along, and I wanted to enjoy this experience. Now hush, before I remove all of your humanity. Anyway, what was most interesting to me was learning that Anne Rice pioneered the way for the more promiscuous vampire. I think the influences were already there, given that Lord Byron was rumored to be wildly bisexual and was quite famous for sleeping around in his time. Rice explored this more explicitly than any other had. She also started one of the most well-known vampire series, and vampire series became more popularized after this. This, in my opinion, is where vampires start to become more refined and attractive, and we start to get that more romanticized version of the vampire. You would come during dinner. So you want to talk about Louis and Lestat. I think what I liked most about this is that it was from the point of view of a vampire, which I hadn't seen in the other choices that I had chose to read. This shows how it's exclusive to be a vampire, but it also showed the different lifestyles of being a vampire. Though, of course, there were some references to Dracula, these felt like a whole new breed of vampires. This is about Vampire Louis telling his story to a reporter. Lestat had turned him into a vampire in a moment of heavy grief and sadness, and it is about the many years that follow in their companionship. We also meet Claudia, the child vampire, and how she takes on the characteristics of Louis and his regard of humanity and art, but also Lestat's greed and hunger, and it is about how they try to find more of their kind. I had to drink it while it's still warm, otherwise it's no good. I will say that I was uncomfortable for the majority of this story. I think mostly because it ends up sexualizing a child, and there have been many debates on this. In my opinion, Claudia is sexualized upon first meeting her, when she is of child body and mind. Of course, the story does discuss this later, that she feels frustrated that she's stuck in this child's body, despite the fact that her mind has grown well beyond her childish looking years. This definitely made being a vampire seem like a more erotic thing, something critics definitely mentioned at the time of the release. I do think this ended up paving the way for vampires to become much more romanticized as time went on. I enjoyed the overall story, with Louis' constant battle between humanity and being a vampire. And although the uncomfortableness of everything ended up making this a 3.5 for me, I had to know more about Louis as his life went on and what led him to sit in that chair and tell his story to a reporter. I wanted to know about his many years of loss and heartache, but also joy. This was one of the few books that actually talks about vampire fashion as well. I think we all have a particular aesthetic in mind when we think of vampires. We think of black and lace and high collars and very Victorian. This may be because a lot of vampire myths that we are familiar with today seem to originate in the Victorian time era, so maybe that Victorianness has stuck to vampires for some reason. They don't really seem like a very modern creature. Maybe that's because we have science that can explain things, and being a vampire used to explain things that people just didn't quite understand. They didn't have the science to understand death and decay and decomposition and the spreading of illnesses. So many times they used vampirism to explain away many things that they didn't understand. They would dig up dead bodies and put stakes in their hearts if they felt the body didn't decompose the way they expected. They would even rip out their organs and burn them if they suspected vampirism. They also think that it may have been the cause of porphyria, which is an illness that can cause rashes in the sunlight. It can also cause the gums to recede, showing a much more elongated tooth. Now, I'm going to go back to drinking my dinner. Jumping in the timeline again to 2005. 5. Though Lord Byron may have provided the inspiration for the vampire, many have long thought that Dracula was inspired by Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler. Though there is no proof that Stoker actually based Dracula off of Vlad the Impaler, it's very hard not to connect the similarities. Vlad the Impaler, as his name suggests, was notorious for the gruesome way that he killed people. One of his favorite ways being that he would impale them on sticks. It is rumored that he would dine among his dying victims and would dip his bread into their blood. His castle also seemed like it could have been an inspiration for Dracula's castle, since the depictions were quite spot on, and I believe many pictures of Vlad's castle are used for Dracula still today. I was quite happy to come across a book that explores this idea quite thoroughly. My dear and unfortunate successor, it is with regret that I imagine you, whoever you are, reading the account I must put down here. The regret is partly for myself, because I will surely be at least in trouble. Maybe dead, or perhaps worse, if this is in your hands. But my regret is also for you, my yet unknown friend, because only by someone who needs such vile information will this letter someday be read. If you are not my successor in some other sense, you will soon be my heir, and I feel sorrow at bequeathing to another human being my own, perhaps unbelievable, experience of evil. Why I myself inherited, I don't know, but I hope to discover that fact eventually. Perhaps in the course of writing to you, or perhaps in the course of further events. Oh, quickly, come in. Have you been standing there very long? I surely hope not. You never know what kind of things are lurking out there these days. You want to know more about The Historian? The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova is a very well-researched book about a kind of secret society in which the members are inducted by a book that just seems to appear in their possession one day. This follows a young woman and her father as he tells his story about how he came upon this society and that he believes Vlad is still alive and that he's a vampire. Then it follows her as she searches for her father after he disappears. It takes place in a lot of ancient libraries and interesting places, and... Are you sure you can't even review this? Excuse me. Did you even read it? Well, yes. I feel I read it. I read most of it. Okay? Now, let me do my job. I accidentally took out an abridged copy from the library. I didn't realize it till I was nearly done. However, I bought a copy, and I plan on reading it all the way through. The only parts that were cut out were parts about their personal lives. It didn't really change the story of hunting down Vlad. I also felt it was enough to fully review the premise of the book, okay? This isn't so much horror as it is historical. And it has some dark academia feels. So naturally, I ate this story up. This focuses heavily on Vlad being a vampire, and it gives a lot of historical information about Vlad the Impaler, which was very well researched. It plays into Dracula, which means dragon, and the Order of the Dragon. I found a lot of these facts really interesting, and it was quite easy to see how these things could inspire immortal blood feeders. Honestly, vampires were absent for most of the story. There are references to Dracula, and they use it almost as a reference to hunting down and killing vampires. This was also interesting because it gave a lot of insight into small towns and their own myths about vampires. But it wasn't necessarily too bogged down with history. Although there is the history of Vlad the Impaler, it's not necessarily enough to feel like the story is heavy. It actually felt a lot like National Treasure at times. Really do come to love the characters, which I'm sure you do even more so in the full version. My mistake. There was also a lot of thrills with the mystery of the letters and the successors and where were they going next. There was attacks by vampires and vampire followers and obsessors. I would say that this was a 5-star read for me. Even though I didn't read the full version, I do think the full version would still make this a 5-star because it would only really further explain those characters that I already love. If you would have told me this was going to be my favorite story of the group, I probably would have thought you were lying, especially because it's massive. I just thought that it gave enough history, but also could give me a riveting tale on top of that. I know wooden stakes would be the proper thing here, but silver works just as well. Let's go hunt some vampires. It may be growing on me. Elizabeth Kostova wasn't the only one who wanted to weave art histories with the paranormal. There's just something kind of thrilling about thinking about how people we may have known may have been influenced by vampires. Sometimes we just want them to be so real, so bad to explain the things in history that we don't quite get. In 2010, Seth Grahame-Smith decided he was going to weave a little bit of the US history in with the paranormal, and more specifically on Abraham Lincoln, and he turned him into a vampire slayer. This follows Abraham Lincoln, and it's after he finds out that his mother's death was actually caused by vampires. It also follows history and twists it about the Civil War. We find out the secret history of the Civil War and how vampires played a role in the birth, the growth, and the death of our nation. Pretend like I just sliced through someone. This honestly felt a lot like a textbook or a history book, just kind of about Abe Lincoln with just some sprinkles of some vampires here and there. And honestly, it was really well researched, but it just couldn't grab my attention. I ended up just not enjoying this that much. It was bogged down with historical details, and it tried to rewrite the Civil War and the fight for freedom, and it tried to say instead that it was just a fight against vampires, which I guess there's probably a metaphor there, but at the end of the day, I don't think the narrative worked that well to try to rewrite the Civil War as something other than that. I get that this is supposed to be historical, and though the writing and the research is pretty well done, the narrative just didn't work for me. That one took a while to die. There were parts of his life that were mixed with vampires that I could have read about all day, you know, when they actually happened. It's just that things got a little foggy when politics got involved. There is an unexpected character who I came to love and I would have loved to see more from, but he wasn't there enough to make this story well worth it. It ended up being a 3-star for me, and I'll probably end up forgetting a lot about it. It's been quite easy to place vampires in a historical setting up until this point, but vampires exist today. I mean, who am I to say if they're truly vampires or not, but they tend to be people who incorporate some form of drinking blood into their diets, usually from willing donors, of course. I do believe because of ridicule they tend to stick to themselves, which is normally how vampires like it anyway. There are also energy vampires, and I'm pretty sure one has sucked me dry. I have heard this term occasionally, and it is people who tend to feed off of other people's energies, which I get. But when it comes to fiction, I wanted a taste of something new and fresh. I wanted a portrayal of vampires in my own lifetime. And with the resurgence of vampire stories, I knew I needed a new release. I also wanted it to be horror, though, since most of the original vampire stories were horror. Vampires were used to explain away medical conditions. What does that look like in a modern science world? And since the ways to kill vampires have varied so greatly, what does that look like today? Earlier this year, Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires came out, and I knew I needed to sink my teeth into it. Get it? Sink my... Never mind. Grady Hendrix's novel is set in the 90s, and it follows stay-at-home mom Patricia and her small community. Her book club meets monthly to talk about true crime books, and they think they're prepared for if anything would happen. Until it happens. Children start dying, and Patricia starts to suspect the newcomer in town. And after several weird occurrences, she really believes that she has this wild theory. But who will believe it, how will she prove it, and how will she save the children? This is definitely the scariest of the bunch that I read, and despite the fact that it is the least vampire-esque, it does have references to vampires, but vampires are loosely mentioned here, mostly because I believe it's set in a more modern society, and we just consider that word fictitious. Who's going to believe anyone that would cry vampire? But this does reference to some of the vampire books that I had previously read, and it heavily references Dracula. But this type of vampire is much more sinister than just the sharp teeth and neck-biting type of vampire. It's a darker, heavier, sexual tone to it. I will say I was infuriated reading this book multiple times because it's set in a very misogynistic society, and there were times I wanted to scream at the characters because they were either heavily gaslighting another character or because they were ignoring their own experiences to make the men in their life happy. This also made me realize that there was a trend among vampire books and that black people tend to be the target for vampires. And this book had racist moments, as had all the other books up to this point. And this one used it more as social commentary, though, in that it talked about how police treat black communities differently and stereotyping, and how gated communities tend to be mostly white privileged people who can ignore issues until it affects them. I will say at times the details of this book were a little too much. The suspense was a little too much, and the details of some of the scary parts were too much. But I think that means it excelled at being a horror novel. It's been a while since a book has provoked this much feeling from me, and I have to give it a 4.5. It's just scary that I can see this type of predator living today, and he could be my own neighbor. Though that story is a modern vampire story, I feel like it still followed a lot of the older vampire story traits, in that the vampire is always white, sexuality is used as a weapon, and, well, there's racist undertones. This is a hard concept for me to grasp in 2020 as we fight for Black lives and gay rights and more representation in books. Now that I've seen the origins, I want to see these stories grow with the world and its diversity and the type of technology we have. I came across the title that does just that. Vampires Never Get Old is actually the inspiration for this video. It's a collection of stories that reimagines vampire stories and the struggles of vampires. I did use my charm to get an e-arc from Macmillan for the purposes of this video. We'll pretend like it was their idea. Vampires never die, am I right? These stories challenge so many stereotypes. What's great is that there's these discussions, like discussion starters at the end of each story. And it talked about the different myths and the stereotypes that they came from and how they changed it and what kind of discussions you could have based around it. And I loved it. I wish all short story collections could have that, you know? What do I know? I don't know. Can't tell you about all the stories because I'm feeling pretty tired. But there were some standout stories. There was the House of Black Sapphires, and the Boys from River Run, and In Kind. And these stories dealt with so many issues, from like family loss to there was a disability story, and even climate change. Like, there was so many stories in here. And, you know, yeah. I really love this collection, and I enjoyed pretty much every story in it. It felt like there was they brought such new blood to so many stereotypes. I mean, I would highly recommend it. You know what they say. Don't knock it till you try it. I will say that I ended up much more deep into the research of vampires than I ever planned on getting. But I felt like I learned a lot. Even about history that I never knew. I would have spent my life assuming that Dracula was the first, and that Vlad the Impaler inspired him. I would have never read what might be one of the best books that I feel like I've ever read. I can now pick up on more vampire references in media, and I feel like I have a deeper understanding of why we feel the need to explain the things that we don't understand with a little bit of myth. I hope you too have gleaned something from this video, or at least gotten a recommendation or two. This discussion has tired me, and my blood has gone cold. The sun has set, so I feel like I must go feed. You will notice that I have not actually shared any information on killing vampires. So I hope you know how to protect yourself, humans. Good night.